The snow had been falling for 6 hours when Eleanor Ashby Walker turned her late husband's old Buick onto a mountain road that didn't appear on any map she could read. She was 61 years old. She was a widow of 18 months, and in the passenger seat beside her sat a folder containing the only thing her two half-brothers had been willing to let her keep, the deed to a collapsing cabin in a town called Maple Hollow, North Carolina, a place her father had owned for 40 years and had never once mentioned to anyone in the family. People at the will reading had laughed when they heard her inheritance. Her own brother Ryan had leaned back in his leather chair and said it out loud in front of the attorney, in front of the cousins, in front of God. "Looks like Dad finally found something worthless enough to leave Eleanor." A few of the cousins had chuckled. Eleanor had simply lowered her eyes and folded her hands in her lap, the way she had been folding her hands in her lap since she was a small girl, learning that arguing with the Walkers never changed anything. But what none of them knew, what not even she knew yet, was that the cabin was not the inheritance. The cabin was only the door, and behind that door, hidden under a single uneven floorboard in a kitchen, no one had cooked in for years, lay a truth her father had spent 4 decades keeping safe. A truth that would unmake every story Eleanor had ever told herself about who she was. Before we go any further, friend, if you've ever been the one in the family who got left out, who was loved quietly when you needed to be loved loudly, who learned to stop expecting and start surviving, please take a moment now and subscribe to this channel. Every story we tell here is for someone like you, and tonight's story is one you'll want to sit with all the way to the end. Now, let me take you back to the cabin. The road climbed and climbed. The pavement turned to gravel. The gravel turned to two ruts in the snow. Pine trees pressed close on either side, so heavy with white that some of their branches had bent all the way down to the forest floor. Eleanor drove slowly. Her hands had begun to ache from gripping the steering wheel the way they had ached on her wedding day 40 years before. The way they had ached at Henry's funeral. The way they ached now whenever she had to do something difficult without anyone beside her to do it with. Henry would have known what to say about this drive. Henry had always known what to say. She passed a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Maple Hollow, population 412. The number had been painted over twice, each correction smaller than the last, as though the town itself had grown tired of counting. A white clapboard church with a slate roof. A general store with a brass bell over the door. A row of pickup trucks parked nose in beneath a single street lamp that had come on early against the gathering dark. The whole place looked like a photograph from a calendar. Eleanor's mother used to hang in their kitchen in 1968, the kitchen of the house her father had walked out of when she was 6 years old. The kitchen where her mother had stood at the window for the rest of her short life, waiting for a man who never came back. Eleanor parked in front of the general store. She did not get out right away. For nearly a minute, she sat with the engine ticking and the snow ticking against the windshield and the dashboard light glowing soft amber across her gloved hands. And she let herself think. The thought she had been refusing to think since the attorney's office in Asheville 3 weeks ago. I do not know why he chose me for this. Thomas Walker had not chosen her for anything else. He had not chosen her at Christmas. He had not chosen her on her wedding day. He had not chosen her when her mother died of pneumonia in a cold rental apartment in 1971. And he had not chosen her in any of the 40 years that followed. He had married a woman named Margaret Sloan the year Eleanor turned 7. He had built that woman a house, given that woman 2 sons, sent those sons to private schools and to law school and to business school. Eleanor had spent her childhood watching from a distance she did not understand. And now at the end of all of it, He had chosen her for a cabin in a town she had never heard of, and her brothers had laughed and she had nodded, and here she was. The brass bell over the door of the general store gave a small, clean sound when she stepped inside. The warmth hit her first. Then the smell, coffee, old wood, kerosene, wood smoke, something baked that morning, and still keeping its sweetness in the air. A pot-bellied stove burned low in the corner. The shelves carried the patient mess of a store that served real people, instead of tourists, canned milk beside lantern wicks, work gloves beside cake mix, a row of horseshoe nails next to a jar of penny candy. Behind the counter sat a woman who looked to be in her early 70s, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy cardigan with a small gold pin at the collar, shaped like a maple leaf. The woman looked up from her newspaper. She did not smile. She studied Eleanor's face for what felt like a long time. Then something in her own face changed, softened, and she set the paper down with care, the way one sets down something fragile. "Lord have mercy," the woman said almost to herself. "You have his eyes." Eleanor felt her breath stop. "I'm sorry." "Thomas," the woman said. "Thomas Walker. You're his girl, aren't you? You're Eleanor." The shop seemed to grow very quiet. The stove popped once. Outside, a clump of snow slid from the roof and landed on the porch with a soft, heavy sound. Eleanor's mouth had gone dry. She had been called many things in her life: Mrs. Walker, Mrs. Ashby once she married Henry Mam at the library where she had worked for 31 years. Ellie when her husband was being tender, and Eleanor when he was being serious. But no stranger had ever in 61 years looked at her and known her as her father's daughter. "How, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "How did you know?" The woman behind the counter folded her hands together on top of a newspaper. Her wedding ring was a thin, worn gold band that had clearly been worn for longer than Eleanor had been alive. "Because your daddy talked about you," she said. "He talked about you every time he came in here. And he came in here, honey, every month for 40 years. Eleanor put a hand on the counter to steady herself. She did not remember reaching for it. The woman watched her with the same calm attention a country doctor brings to a patient she has known since birth. "My name is Hattie Bramble," the woman said. "I've owned this store since 1979. Your daddy used to sit right there in that chair by the stove and drink a cup of coffee with 2 sugars and tell me how his girl was getting on. He showed me your high school graduation picture. He showed me your wedding picture, the one of you and Henry on the steps of the courthouse, that little bouquet of daisies. He kept a clipping in his wallet from the Asheville paper when you were promoted to head librarian. The wallet was worn so thin you could see the leather through the leather." Eleanor was crying now, quietly, without permission. The way she had learned long ago to cry in public, if she had to cry at all. No sound, only the slow, steady leak of tears. She could not stop. Hattie Bramble did not offer her a tissue. She simply turned, took a clean folded handkerchief from a drawer behind her, and laid it on the counter within Eleanor's reach, the way you lay food out for a wild animal you do not want to startle. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered. "I don't." "Take your time, honey." Eleanor pressed the handkerchief against her eyes. She thought of her mother at the kitchen window in 1971. She thought of the silence at every Christmas of her childhood. She thought of the single card her father had sent her on her wedding day, signed only "Be Happy, TW." A card she had thrown in the trash within the hour, because at 31 years old she had not been able to forgive a man for showing up only on paper. He came here every month. Every single month, drove up from Asheville the second Saturday, regardless of weather. We learned to expect him. The road washes out sometimes in March, snowed in February, didn't matter. He came. Why? Eleanor said. The word came out almost angry, almost a plea. Why this town? Why this cabin? Why did he? She could not finish the sentence. Why did he come here every month for 40 years to talk about a daughter he never visited? Hattie Bramble looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very gently, "Honey, that is something you are going to have to find out for yourself. I promised your daddy I would not be the one to tell you. But I will tell you this. That cabin up there is not what your brothers think it is. And you are not who your brothers think you are. You drive careful on that mountain. And you come back and see me when you're ready to talk." She drew a small folded paper map from beneath the counter. She traced a route with one weathered finger. Then she paused and looked up at Eleanor over the top of her reading glasses. "Keep the fire burning when you get there," she said. "That cabin gets cold faster than you'd believe." Eleanor was nearly to the door when Hattie called after her. "Your daddy left something with my husband Frank years ago," she said. "Frank passed in 2019. The lawyer came and took it after Thomas died. I just wanted you to know there are things that man set aside. Things that aren't on any list those brothers of yours have ever seen. You understand me?" Eleanor did not understand, not yet. But she nodded because in that moment nodding was all she could do. The bell rang once as she stepped back out into the snow. The road from town to the cabin took her another 40 minutes climbing the whole way. The last quarter mile was barely a road at all, a track between two stone walls long ago swallowed by laurel, the tire ruts so deep in some places that the underside of the Buick scraped over packed snow. She came around a final curve and saw it. The cabin sat at the far end of a clearing, its back to a stand of black hemlocks, its face to a small frozen pond. The roof had taken the weather of 40 winters and shown every one of them. The porch sagged on the left side. A single chimney rose from the center, dark and cold. No smoke, no light. And yet Eleanor would think about this later. Sitting by the fire she had not yet built, the cabin did not look abandoned. It looked patient. It looked the way her grandmother's house had looked the summer before her grandmother died. When the old woman was tired and had stopped fussing with the porch flowers, but still came out every evening to sit on the steps and watch the road. The cabin looked like it was sitting on the steps watching the road. She killed the engine. The silence that came in was so complete it had a texture to it, a hush so thick she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She sat for a long moment with the brass key the attorney had given her warming slowly in her gloved palm. Then she got out, climbed the porch steps one at a time, listened to each one groan beneath her boots, and slid the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted. She had to lean her weight against it. With a soft, satisfied click, a sound like a door remembering how to be opened, it turned. The cabin breathed out at her. Cedar, old paper, cold ash. Something faintly sweet like apples that had been stored once in a cellar a long time ago. Eleanor stepped inside and held very still. Her flashlight beam swept across a single open room, a stone fireplace built of round river rock at the far wall, a worn leather chair drawn close to it. A square pine table with two chairs at the room's center. A small kitchen along the back with an iron stove and a deep porcelain sink. A doorway led off to a bedroom on the right. A narrow wooden staircase climbed to what she guessed was a loft. The floor was plank pine scarred with use dusted, but not deeply. The bookshelves to the left of the fireplace were full. 40 years of absence had not turned this place into a ruin. Someone had been keeping it, or it had been keeping itself for someone. She set down her bag. She built a fire, clumsily 3 matches, the kindling damp at first, and watched the small flame catch and grow. The shadows in the room shifted, softened. The cabin warmed by inches. When she could feel her fingers again, she stood and walked slowly along the bookshelves, reading the spines. The Foxfire book, a Bible bound in green cloth, gold-leafed pages worn at the edge of Psalms. The Yearling, a collection of Robert Frost, Walden. Beside the books on the middle shelf, a small framed photograph. She lifted it down. Her father stood, younger than she had ever seen him, perhaps in his 40s, on the porch of this same cabin. Beside him stood an elderly woman with white hair pulled into a low bun, one hand resting on his arm in the unmistakable gesture of a mother to a son. Both of them were smiling. Eleanor turned the frame over. The cardboard backing had been cut and replaced once, then again, and on the cardboard, in her father's blocky engineer's handwriting, were 4 words: "Keep the fire burning." She sat down in the leather chair. She held the photograph in her lap. Outside, the wind had begun to move through the hemlocks with a long, low, almost human sound. She thought of Hattie Bramble. She thought of 40 years of second Saturdays. She thought of the word daughter spoken in a stranger's mouth, and the way it had landed in her chest, like a coin dropped into still water, sending rings out and out and out. Her father had not been a man who used the word daughter. He had been a man who used the word Eleanor once a year on a Christmas card signed only T.W. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out the second thing the attorney had given her, a small sealed envelope of heavy ivory paper. The attorney had handed it to her at the end of the will reading, after the brothers had walked out laughing. He had held it for a moment longer than necessary before letting go. "There were also some private papers your father asked me to keep," he had said, very quietly, so that no one but her could hear. "I was instructed to give them to you only after you had been to the cabin. So when you've spent a night up there, Mrs. Ashby, you call my office. We have some more talking to do." She had nodded, then the way she nodded at everything. She had put the envelope in her purse and forgotten it for 3 weeks. Now she turned it over in her hands. On the front, in her father's same blocky writing, 3 words: "Not yet, Eleanor." That was all. She almost laughed. She did not open it. She set it on the small table beside the chair, and she sat for a long time watching the fire. And somewhere around midnight, she fell asleep without meaning to the photograph still resting in her lap. She woke at 3:15. She knew the time because her wristwatch glowed faintly when she lifted it close to her face, the same watch Henry had given her on their 10th anniversary, the one she had not been able to take off since the funeral. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as though the silence itself had woken her. Then she heard it. A faint creak, very slow, somewhere near the kitchen. She sat very still. Old house, she told herself. Cooling timbers, settling joists. The creak came again, slow, soft, almost rhythmic. She rose. She picked up the flashlight. She walked in stocking feet to the kitchen doorway. The flashlight beam moved across the iron stove, the porcelain sink, the small square table. Nothing. No animal, no draft, no obvious source. She was about to turn away when the beam passed over the floor, and she stopped. One of the plank boards near the table was higher than the others, only by 1/4 inch, only enough that the eye sweeping past would not register it, but the flashlight beam, raking at a low angle, had caught the shadow of its lifted edge. Eleanor knelt. She brushed dust from the seam, and there, set flush into the wood, and worn nearly black with age, was a small iron ring no bigger than a wedding band. That is something you are going to have to find out for yourself. She wrapped her finger through the ring. She pulled. The plank lifted with a long, low groan, the way the porch steps had groaned beneath her boots. The sound of something remembering how to be opened. Cold air rose into the kitchen, sharp with the smell of dry stone and ink and old paper. Eleanor shone her light down. A narrow staircase descended into darkness hand-cut from the mountain itself, stone and timber vanishing past the reach of her beam. For a long minute she did not move. Every part of her body that had spent 61 years being sensible told her to put the plank back, to wait until morning, to call someone, anyone. But there was no one to call. Henry was gone. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. And the only person in the world who knew she was here was a stranger in a navy cardigan who had told her that cabin is not what your brothers think it is, and you are not who your brothers think you are. Eleanor took the first step down. The air grew colder. The smell grew stronger. Paper, leather, dry stone, the faint mineral cleanliness of a cellar that had been built right and kept right. 12 steps. She counted them. At the bottom, her flashlight swept across a room she could not at first make sense of. It was not a cellar, it was an archive. 3 walls were lined with wooden shelves built from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves stood rows and rows and rows of leather-bound journals, black-brown, oxblood, and stacked beside them boxes labeled by year in her father's same blocky hand: 1971, 1972, 1973, all the way to the year of his death. Against the 4th wall stood a small writing desk and a single wooden chair. On the desk lay one journal set out alone, as though placed there for someone expected. Eleanor crossed to it. She sat down. She opened the cover with hands that had begun to shake. On the first page, in ink that had faded only slightly, her father had written one sentence: "If you are reading this, Eleanor, then I have finally been forgiven enough to be heard." She turned the page. The second page held only this: "Look in the bottom drawer of this desk. Open the box, put on the key, then come back and read me." Eleanor lowered the journal. She looked at the desk. The bottom drawer was deeper than the others. She pulled it open. Inside alone sat a wooden box about the size of a family Bible, dark with age, the lid carved deeply with a name. Not Walker, not her married name, Ashby. The name carved into the lid was the name she had used only as a child before her father remarried. And the woman named Margaret Sloane began correcting the household paperwork. Eleanor Ruth Ashby, the name her mother had given her. The name her father had clearly still been using 40 years later in private in this hidden room on a box made by his own hands. Eleanor lifted the box onto the desk. She raised the lid. Inside, tied in 3 neat bundles with faded blue ribbon, lay dozens upon dozens of unopened letters. And resting on top of the letters, threaded through a soft leather cord worn dark with hand-link, was a single small key. Brass, old, polished by years of being touched. The key did not match the cabin lock. It did not match the desk drawer. It did not match any lock she could see. She lifted the cord. She slipped it over her head. The key settled cold against her chest, just below the hollow of her throat, exactly where her hand could find it without looking. The way her hand had found Henry's wedding ring on the chain she had worn beneath her blouse every day since the funeral. She drew out the topmost letter. The envelope was sealed. Across the front, in handwriting she had spent her whole life refusing to recognize, were 4 words written in her father's blocky hand: "To my daughter, Eleanor." Above the words, in the upper left corner, a date: December 12th, 1972, her 7th birthday. Eleanor lowered the letter to the desk. She placed both palms flat on the wood. She closed her eyes. Somewhere above her in the kitchen of a cabin, her brothers had laughed at the fire she had built was still burning. Somewhere outside in a town she had never heard of. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Hattie Bramble was sleeping in a navy cardigan, having waited 40 years to call her by her father's name. And here, beneath a single uneven floorboard, in a hidden room full of 40 years of a man's voice that no one had ever let her hear, Eleanor Ashby Walker. 61 years old widow of 18 months, the daughter no one had chosen, finally understood that she had not been forgotten at all. She had only been kept. She did not yet know by whom. She did not yet know from whom. She did not yet know why. But the brass key against her chest had grown warm from her skin, and the first letter was waiting on the desk. And somewhere in this room she felt it now. The way an old woman feels, weather coming, was the answer to every question she had carried like a stone since 1971. She opened her eyes. She broke the seal on the envelope. And by the dim glow of a flashlight failing in a hidden room beneath a mountain, Eleanor began at last to read. The first letter was short. 3 small paragraphs written by a man not yet 40 in the careful printing of someone who is afraid of his own handwriting. Eleanor, you turned 7 today. Your mother used to make a yellow cake with white icing on your birthday and put a single candle in the middle no matter how old you were. She said 1 candle was enough to make a wish on. I am writing this because I am not going to be allowed to call you tonight. I am writing this because I do not know any other way to say I love you that they cannot take from me. I will keep writing. One day you will read these. Today I hope you got the yellow cake. Eleanor lowered the letter to the desk. She had not had a yellow cake on her 7th birthday. She had eaten a slice of grocery store sheet cake at a neighbor's apartment in Charleston, brought down the hall by a woman who pitied her 3 months after her mother's funeral. In the season when her father had stopped answering the door, she had been told by a great aunt who came once and never returned that her father was sick, then that he had moved, then that he had a new family now and a new little girl, and she should be brave and grow up and stop asking. By the time she was 9, she had stopped asking. By the time she was 12, she had stopped wondering. By the time she was 20, she had built around her chest the kind of careful wall that only librarians and widows and quiet women in the back pew of country churches know how to build. And here, in his own hand on her 7th birthday, he had written, I love you. She drew the second letter out of the bundle, then the third. Then she stopped because her hands had begun to shake too badly to hold the paper. She climbed the stone steps. She closed the floorboard behind her. She walked to the leather chair by the fire, and she sat in it without taking off her coat, and she stayed there until the sky over the frozen pond turned the soft gray of a dove's breast, and the first crows began to call across the hemlocks. She did not cry. She had cried last night. The crying was finished for now. What had replaced it was something colder and steadier, a long, slow turning in the chest, the way a key turns in a lock that has been waiting a long time. The first thing she did when the sun came up was the simplest. She walked to the porch and she swept it. There was a broom leaning inside the front door, old and split-ended. The bristles softened by years. She swept the porch from the door to the steps and from the steps back to the door twice, and then she shook the broom over the rail and watched dust catch the morning light and fall away across the snow. It was not a meaningful act. It was the act of a woman who had been a librarian for 31 years and knew that when the world inside your chest was too large to look at, you started with what was small enough to hold. She did not call the attorney. Not yet. The day passed in small failures. She tried to pump water from the kitchen tap, and the pump handle moved freely with no resistance and produced nothing. She tried to light the iron stove and discovered the flue was closed. She opened it, tried again, and filled the room with smoke that took an hour to clear. She broke a glass jar trying to open it. She slipped on the porch steps carrying a load of firewood and bruised her hip so badly that for the rest of the day she walked with the slow, careful gait of a woman 30 years older than she was. By late afternoon, she sat at the pine table with her hands flat on the wood and admitted to herself out loud in the empty room, "I do not know how to live in this house." The empty room said nothing back. Then, after a moment, the fire crackled once in what felt almost like an answer. She drove down the mountain at dusk. She had planned to buy bottled water and a can opener, and a box of matches that worked. What she did was sit in the parking lot of the general store for 10 minutes with the engine running, gathering the kind of small courage required to walk back into a place where someone might say her father's name out loud. The brass bell, the pot-bellied stove, Hattie behind the counter, this time wearing a soft grey cardigan and reading a battered paperback of Cold Mountain. Hattie looked up. She set the book down. She did not say "I told you so," and she did not say "you look terrible," though both would have been true. She said, "There's coffee on. Come sit by the stove." Eleanor sat. Hattie poured. Hattie pushed a small white plate of cornbread toward her across the counter without ceremony. Eleanor ate. After a while she said, "The water doesn't work. Pump's primed wrong," Hattie said. "There's a glass jar of well water in the cabinet under the sink. You pour the whole jar down the pump while you work the handle. It catches." "There's no jar." "There will be." Eleanor looked up. "I'm sorry." "There will be," Hattie said again mildly. "By tomorrow morning. Don't look at me like that, honey. I'm not the one bringing it." Eleanor did not ask what she meant. She had learned in one day that questions in Maple Hollow were answered when the answers were ready and not before. She drove home. She climbed into bed in her clothes because she could not bring herself to undress in a house she did not yet know how to live in. She slept for 10 hours. When she went out onto the porch in the morning, there was a glass quart jar of clear water sitting at the top of the steps. A length of clean cotton twine had been tied around its neck. No note, no name. She brought it inside. She primed the pump. The pump caught on the third pull, and the Cold Mountain water came up sweet and clean and tasting faintly of stone. She stood at the sink and laughed once, a small surprised sound she had not heard herself make in 18 months. The next day there was a bundle of split kindling on the porch, tied with the same kind of cotton twine. The day after that, a small basket holding 6 brown eggs and a half-pound of butter wrapped in waxed paper. The day after that, a folded square of canvas that turned out to be a window storm cover sized exactly for the kitchen window that had been letting in a draft she had not yet figured out how to seal. Eleanor took to bringing each gift inside slowly. She would set it on the table and stand looking at it for a long moment, as though it were a small wild creature that might bolt. Then she would put the eggs in the cool box, or hang the canvas over the window, or stack the kindling beside the stove. She did not know who was leaving these things. She knew only that someone in this town had decided without consulting her that she was worth keeping alive while she learned how to live up here. And by the 4th day, when she found a small jar of honey on the porch railing, with a paper tag tied around the lid that read, "Only welcome," Eleanor sat down on the porch step in her coat and did the thing she had been refusing to do for 61 years. She let herself be helped. She returned to the room beneath the floor every night. She read the letters in order. Birthday by birthday, Christmas by Christmas. And she kept a small ledger of her own at the desk, a notebook in which she wrote down what each letter told her. Year by year, her father's voice grew older inside the pages, the handwriting steadier in some letters and shakier in others, depending, she came to understand, on what season of his life he was in. In one letter from the spring she was 11, he had written, "I drove down to your school today. I stood across the road by the chain-link fence and watched you come out at 3 o'clock with a green book bag and a girl with a long red braid. You walked her to the corner of Locust Street and then turned back and walked home alone. You were singing. I could not hear the song, but I could see your mouth moving, and I knew you were singing. I drove back up the mountain. I did not sleep that night, because I did not want to forget the way your mouth moved when you sang." Eleanor laid that letter down very carefully. She had been singing King of the Road that spring. She had loved that song. She had not told anyone she loved it. She had not known anyone had ever known. In another letter from the year she was 19, the handwriting had changed. It was harder, more pressed into the page. Eleanor, I drove to Asheville again last weekend with the envelope for your 18th birthday card, which I am 1 year late delivering because I am a coward. I sat in the rental car across the street from your dormitory at the community college for 2 hours. I had decided I would walk up the steps and knock on the door of the residence director and ask to be allowed to see you. I had practiced what I would say. Twice I had my hand on the door of the car. Twice I put it back on the steering wheel. The third time, a young woman in a yellow sweater came out the front door of the dormitory and walked across the lawn with a stack of library books, and I saw your mother's face on you so clearly that I could not breathe. I drove home. The card is still on the dashboard of my truck. I will mail it tomorrow. I will not. I do not know. She read that letter 3 times. On the 6th night, she opened the bundle from the year she was 33, the year she and Henry had married, and she found something different. Tucked inside the envelope was a second piece of paper, thicker than the letter, folded in fourths. She drew it out. It was a photocopy of a court document. In the matter of the petition of Thomas E. Walker for visitation rights to the minor Eleanor R. Walker, the court finds the petitioner has produced no evidence sufficient to the text continued for 2 pages. The judgment was dated 1974. Eleanor was 8 years old in 1974. There was another photocopy behind it, 1977, another, 1981, another, 1984. Petition denied. Petition denied. Petition denied. Petition withdrawn at petitioner's request. 4 petitions. 4 denials. Eleanor stared at the papers a long time. She did not understand. He had been her father. He had been a wealthy man, a respected man, a man who employed a law firm in Asheville the size of a city block. He had filed 4 times in 10 years to be allowed to see her, to be allowed to see his own daughter, and 4 times he had been turned away. By whom? Her mother had died in 1971. There had been no one left to refuse him. Unless... She flipped backward through the bundle, hunting. In a letter from 1973, almost as an aside in a paragraph she had skimmed too fast the first time, he had written, "Margaret has consulted attorneys. She tells me a man of my reputation cannot be seen pursuing a child from a prior household while building a marriage. She tells me the courts will not look kindly. She tells me she will not look kindly. I am ashamed to say I am listening to her. God forgive me, Eleanor. I am listening to her because it is easier than not listening to her." Margaret. Eleanor's stepmother. Margaret Sloan Walker, who at this very moment was still alive in a brick house in West Asheville and who at the will reading 3 weeks ago had touched the back of Eleanor's hand briefly and said, "I always wondered how you were getting on, dear." Eleanor's hands had gone cold against the desk. She thought of Ryan's flat brown eyes at the will reading. She thought of Connor's small smirk. She thought of 40 Christmases. She thought of the single card a year sent dutifully through the mail, signed T.W. And she understood with the dull, final certainty of a woman who has been a librarian long enough to recognize a primary source when she holds one that there had been other cards. There had been hundreds of other cards, and someone had been intercepting them at the receiving end for 40 years. On Sunday morning, she drove down to Maple Hollow, and she did not stop at the general store. She drove past it 2 blocks and parked in front of the white clapboard church. The bell was ringing. Old people in heavy coats were making their way up the salted walk with the careful sideways step of country people who have learned not to trust ice. Eleanor sat in the car until the bell stopped. Then she got out and went in. She slipped into the last pew on the left. The church smelled of pine boards and candle wax and the lavender soap of women who had bathed before sunrise. The minister was a tall man, perhaps in his late 60s, narrow-shouldered, with a soft Carolina voice that did not push. His sermon was about the parable of the lost coin. And when she hath found it, she calleth her friends and her neighbors together, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the peace which I had lost." After the service, Eleanor waited at the back of the church until the line at the door had thinned. The minister took her hand. He looked at her for a moment longer than a stranger would. Then he said very quietly, "You're Eleanor." She nodded. "Reverend Ellis Cobb," he said. "I knew your father. Come back to my office, please. I have something I have wanted to give you for 19 years. His office was a small room behind the choir loft. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a brass coat rack, a wood stove, and a single framed photograph above the desk. A Christmas Eve service, snowy night candles in the windows, a row of folding chairs full of children, and standing at the back, almost out of the frame, a man Eleanor had now seen many times in the photographs in the bookshelf below, her father. Reverend Cobb opened a drawer and lifted out a long wooden box, the size of a checkbook ledger. "Your father gave this to me in 2006, Anna," he said. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him before he made it right with you, I was to keep this here and give it only to you, and only after you had spent time at the cabin. He was very particular. He said not before. He said if I gave it to you before you had been to the cabin, you would not be ready to understand it." He set the box on the desk between them. "I have not opened it, Mrs. Ashby. I do not know what is inside. I have moved it from one drawer to another every Christmas for 19 years. Eleanor opened it. Inside lay a stack of cancelled checks banded by year going back to 1972. Each check had been made out to the same beneficiary, the church's Children of the Mountain Fund. A small fund, Reverend Cobb explained, had been set up in 1965 to help orphans and runaways and children of broken homes through hard winters. The amounts varied. Some years $300, some years $3,000. Every check carried the same memo line written in her father's blocky printing. "In honor of my daughter Eleanor, whom I have failed, 48 checks, 48 Christmases." Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth. Reverend Cobb sat very quietly across from her, his hands folded in his lap, his thumb moving slowly across the gold band on his finger. He did not look away. He did not pretend not to see her cry. After a long while he said, "Mrs. Ashby, your father came up here on the second Saturday of every month. And he stopped in this office for half an hour, and he sat in that chair, and he did not say very much. We mostly drank coffee. But once in 1998, the year my own wife died, he told me something. He said, "Reverend, if I had walked away cleanly, that would have been a sin. But if I had fought when fighting would have ruined her childhood, that would have been a different sin. I chose the sin she would not have to live inside of. I do not expect to be forgiven for choosing. I only expect if she ever comes here that she will see I was choosing all along." Eleanor drove home in a silence she could feel against her skin. She did not turn on the radio. She did not weep. She thought about her mother at the kitchen window in 1971. She thought about the single Christmas card a year and the way she had thrown it in the trash unopened every December after she turned 25. She thought about Margaret Sloane Walker's powdered hand resting briefly on her own at the will reading. By the time she pulled into the clearing in front of the cabin, she had stopped seeing the road. The fire had burned itself out. She built it back up. Then she got back into the Buick, and she drove all the way down the mountain again into Maple Hollow, and she went to the hardware store, and she bought a hammer, a box of nails, a putty knife, a quart of clear weatherproofing, 3 replacement window panes, a saw, and a small can of porch paint the color of fresh cream. The man at the counter did not ask why. He simply added the items up and said, "I'll throw in the brushes, ma'am." She tried to pay for the brushes. He shook his head once and would not take her money. She began to repair the cabin. She replaced the broken pane in the kitchen window. She nailed down the loose board on the porch. She caulked the gap around the doorframe that had been letting in the wind. She was clumsy at first, and the work took her 3 times longer than it should have. But on the 4th day, she stood back from the porch and looked at the swept boards and the putted window and the fresh small line of cream paint along the trim, and she understood in a quiet way that this cabin had been built by someone and kept by someone and given to someone, and that for 40 years it had been waiting for a hand. She had a hand. She did the work. People in town began to come up the mountain, not all at once and not in any organized way. A man named Walter Pike, who Hattie said was a Vietnam veteran who'd been living in his pickup truck since his sister had passed in the spring, came up one afternoon and rehung the kitchen door so it closed flush in the jamb. He took no money. He stayed for coffee. When she pressed him to take something, he set a single split log of seasoned oak by the fireplace and said only, "Add this to the fire tonight, ma'am. That's what I'd take." A woman from the choir at Reverend Cobb's church drove up with a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel and a card signed by 12 names Eleanor did not recognize. The card said only, "We knew your daddy. We are glad you came." A boy of maybe 16 in a hand-me-down barn coat brought his father's chainsaw and cut and stacked half a cord of firewood along the south wall of the cabin without ever once knocking on the door. When Eleanor went out to thank him, he ducked his head and said, "Ma'am, my granddaddy lived in this house when he was a boy. My granddaddy told me to come." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. So she said, "Thank you," which she was learning was sometimes the only true thing one human being could say to another. On the night of the 11th day, the snow began again. It came down in slow, heavy curtains the way it had on the night she had first arrived. Eleanor had just put a small pot of soup on the back of the stove and was standing at the kitchen window watching the pond disappear under fresh white when she heard a sound that did not belong. Tires. A car coming up the mountain road. 2 cars. She knew before she saw them who it was. She had known for 3 days that it was coming. The brass key was warm against the hollow of her throat. Ryan's silver sedan came around the bend first. Connor's black truck followed close behind. They parked side by side in the clearing without bothering to angle out of the way of her Buick. They got out wearing wool overcoats that had never been broken in. Ryan carried a leather folder under his arm. Connor carried a flashlight he did not need. Eleanor opened the door before they could knock. She did not invite them in. She stood in the doorway in her father's old wool work shirt, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands smelling of the soup she had been stirring, and she looked at her two brothers across 40 years of distance, and she waited. Ryan spoke first. He had always spoken first. He said, "Eleanor, we need to talk." Connor behind him was already looking past her into the cabin, at the lit fire, at the swept floor, at the photograph on the bookshelf, at the leather chair, at the table set for one, at all of it. His expression flattened in a way that was almost involuntary. He had not expected the place to look kept. She stepped back finally and let them in. They sat at the pine table. She did not offer them coffee. Ryan opened the leather folder. He drew out a sheaf of papers. "We've been doing some checking," he said, "about this property and about some other property our father appears to have held in trust. Property which was not disclosed at the will reading." Eleanor said nothing. "We believe," Ryan said, picking the word carefully, "that you may be in possession or about to come into possession of assets that properly belong to the estate. And we believe it would be in everyone's interest, yours in particular, Eleanor, if you cooperated with us in returning those assets to the estate for proper distribution." She still said nothing. Connor leaned forward. "Eleanor, be reasonable. Dad wasn't well at the end. He made decisions that you have to understand the family." "I am family," she said. The room went quiet. She had not meant to speak the words that way. They had come out flatter and harder than she had thought. She was capable of the voice of a librarian, shutting down a noisy patron after 31 years of patience. Ryan's face changed, just a little. He laid one hand flat on the leather folder. "Eleanor," he said in a tone so calm it was almost kind, "if you do not cooperate with us voluntarily, the firm I work for will file a petition in probate court to have this property and any related property placed in escrow, pending an investigation of undue influence. We will have to allege that Dad was not of sound mind. We will have to allege that whatever you have found up here is the product of confusion in his final years. It will be ugly, Eleanor. It will be public. There will be a story in the Asheville paper. There will be sworn statements about your mother. There will be sworn statements about your childhood. It will not go well for anyone, especially not for you." Eleanor sat very still. She thought of the 4 denied petitions in the room beneath the floor. She thought of Margaret has consulted attorneys. She thought of 48 checks marked, "In honor of my daughter, Eleanor, whom I have failed." And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she had spent her entire life believing she was the smallest person in any room, because that was what she had been taught to believe at 6 years old in a kitchen, where her mother stood at the window waiting for a man who never came back. She was not the smallest person in this room. She reached up slowly, and she drew the brass key out from beneath her collar. She set it on the table between them. She said very quietly, "Ryan, your mother spent 40 years intercepting his letters to me. There are 4 denied petitions for visitation in this house. There are 48 cancelled checks at the church in town. Reverend Ellis Cobb is prepared to testify to all of it. I have not yet called the attorney. I have not yet called the Asheville paper. I have not yet decided whether I am going to." She did not raise her voice. But you came up here to threaten me with a story. So before you drive back down this mountain tonight, I think you should know I have the story. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire popped softly behind her. Outside, the snow was coming harder now. Ryan's mouth opened, and then closed, and then opened again. Connor's flashlight was loose in his hand. He did not seem to know what to do with it. Ryan stood. He gathered his folder. He moved toward the door without looking at her. At the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, in a voice she had never heard from him before. Thinner, older, the voice of a 58-year-old man who has just discovered that he is not the person he had spent his life pretending to be. We will be back, Eleanor, with counsel. Then he walked out into the snow. Connor followed. The black truck pulled out first, fast throwing snow. The silver sedan went after it. Eleanor watched the taillights disappear around the bend. She closed the door. She walked to the table. She picked up the brass key. She held it in her closed fist against her chest, and she stood in the middle of the room for a long time alone. The soup had begun to scorch on the back of the stove. She did not move. She did not move because she had finally understood the part she had not understood until tonight. They had not come for the cabin. They had not come for the journals. They had come because they were afraid of what their mother had done. And they had come to find out what Eleanor already knew, which meant Margaret Sloane Walker, 81 years old, in a brick house in West Asheville, was the one who had sent them. Which meant Margaret knew that Eleanor was here. Which meant Margaret had always known the cabin existed. Which meant Margaret had been waiting for 40 years for someone to open the floorboard. And as the soup burned slowly behind her, and the snow rose against the windows, and the brass key bit a small warm circle into the palm of her hand, Eleanor, Ashby Walker finally heard beneath the silence of the cabin the soft and unmistakable sound of a much larger door beginning at last to open. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the leather chair with the soup pot off the stove and the kitchen door braced shut against a wind that had begun to push hard against the south wall. And she watched the fire, and she made a list inside her head, the way her mother had taught her to make lists when something was too large to think about all at once. 1. Call the attorney in the morning. 2. Bring the journals up out of the room beneath the floor and put them somewhere a person could find them without knowing where to look. 3. Find what the brass key opens, because the key opens something. He would not have left her a key that opened nothing. The wind died some time before dawn. She must have slept a little after all, because she came awake to a quiet so deep it felt like a sound. The fire had gone down to a soft red breath at the back of the grate. The light through the east window was the pale silver of a winter morning that has not yet decided whether it will be cloudy. She rose. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it. The pond outside had frozen the rest of the way in the night, and a single deer had crossed it before sunrise, leaving a clean line of black hoofprints from one shore to the other. Eleanor watched the prints for a long time. Then she set down the cup, and she went and got the hammer she had bought at the hardware store, and she walked to the fireplace. She did not know how she had known, only that during the long night something in her had circled and circled around the photograph above the mantel. Her father young, the white-haired woman beside him, the 4 words on the cardboard backing. And at some hour she could not name, she had remembered that her father, in one of the letters from the year she was 26, had written, "Your great-grandmother Ruth used to keep her important papers behind a stone in the chimney. She said no fire ever burned hot enough to harm a paper God meant to keep. Eleanor knelt at the hearth. She ran her gloved hand along the river rock face of the fireplace stone by stone from the floor up. Most of them were set tight. One at the height of her shoulder when she pressed it gave back a small sound that was not quite hollow, but was not quite full either. She worked the putty knife around its edges. It came out clean in her hand, the way a tooth comes out of a child's gum when its time has truly come. Behind the stone set into a small iron pocket, the size of a family Bible, was a strongbox. The lock was small, brass. She lifted the cord from her neck. The brass key turned in the lock the way a key turns when it has finally found the door it was made for, without effort, without question, almost gratefully. Eleanor opened the lid. 3 things lay inside. A long manila envelope sealed, a small black ledger book soft with handling, and on the top of both, weighted there as though it were the most fragile of the 3, a single folded sheet of cream paper, hand-trimmed at the edges, dated 1932, signed at the bottom by a name she had been carrying in the back of her throat since the day Hattie Bramble first said, "You have his eyes." She unfolded the cream paper first. "To whoever opens this box, my name is Ruth Eleanor Ashby. I am 63 years old today, and I am writing this in the year of our Lord 1932. This cabin was built by my father in 1889, with hands he had used to fight in a war he never spoke of. He raised me here. When he died, he gave me one instruction. He said, 'Daughter, this place is not for the keeping of money. It is for the keeping of people.' He said, 'When a man or a woman comes to this door with nothing, you do not ask their name and you do not ask their reason. You give them a fire and a roof and a meal and a bed, and if they want to tell you their name in the morning, that is their gift to you.' I have kept that instruction for 41 years. The Depression has come now, and there are more at the door than there have ever been. I cannot keep this place for many more years. I am writing this so that whoever comes after me will know the rule. Every generation, one person in this family is given this cabin. Not the eldest, not the richest. The one who knows what it is to be cold and be let in. I do not yet know who in the next generation that will be. I trust the cabin to choose. Keep the fire burning. Ruth." Eleanor lowered the page. She thought of a small girl of 6 standing in a kitchen in Charleston in 1972, watching her mother stand at the window. She thought of an orphan plate of grocery store sheet cake brought down the hall by a pitying neighbor. She thought of every cold she had been let in from since. She opened the manila envelope. Inside was a second will. Single page, handwritten, notarized in the county courthouse of a town she had never heard of, dated 9 months before her father's death. It did not contradict the public will her brothers had divided at the attorney's office. It only added one thing the public will had not mentioned. "To my daughter, Eleanor Ruth Ashby Walker, I leave and entrust the Appalachian Hearth Trust, a charitable trust I incorporated in 1979 under the laws of the state of North Carolina, for the purpose of providing winter shelter, food, and assistance without question or condition to any person in need within the counties of Madison, Yancey, and Mitchell. The trust holds at the time of this writing assets sufficient to its purpose for the next 40 years. It has been operated quietly by me and 3 trustees of my choosing. My sons, Ryan and Connor, have never been informed of its existence and are not under any reading of this will or the law entitled to any portion of its assets which are not part of my personal estate and are not subject to probate. I name my daughter Eleanor as sole successor trustee. She will know what to do with it because she will know what it is for. She has been cold. She knows the price of being let in. Thomas E. Walker." Eleanor sat down on the hearth. The stone was warm against her legs. The fire she had built the night before was waking back up in the grate, drawing fresh air across the new gap in the chimney face, and behind her, in the room, the light had shifted to the soft buttery yellow of a winter morning that had finally chosen to be clear. He had not been a man who used the word daughter. He had used it twice on a piece of paper in a wall where no one but her could find it, written in the hand of a man who knew he was running out of time. She did not cry. She had cried already in the night, the steady, ungrieving way an old river goes over a stone. What she did instead was lift the small black ledger out of the box, open it to the first page, and read. It was not an accounting ledger. It was a list. 43 years of entries written in her father's blocky hand, with no commentary and no flourish. January 14th, 1980. Family of 4 house fire on Caney Branch Road. 2 weeks lodging, replacement clothing, 3 months grocery support. February 3rd, 1981. Widow 68, husband died. December, no heating, fuel. Tank filled, chimney repaired. April 11th, 1982, young man 20, no last name given, walking frostbite, both feet. 3 weeks lodging. Page after page. Some entries were 2 lines, some were 10. None of them carried a single name that could identify the family or the widow or the young man. He had not kept their names. He had only kept the date and the help, and sometimes in the margin in pencil, 2 soft words, fire burning. Eleanor closed the ledger. She placed it back in the strongbox. She put the will and Ruth's letter and the brass key on top of it. She placed the stone back into its iron pocket in the chimney face, and she sat for a long while with her hands open on her knees. Then she stood and she put on her coat and she drove down the mountain. Not to call the attorney, not yet. First she stopped at the church. Reverend Ellis Cobb was alone in the sanctuary, replacing the candles in the windows. Eleanor told him what she had found. She told him what she meant to do. He listened without interrupting, his long, thin hands folded in front of him, the way they had been folded the day he had handed her the wooden box of cancelled checks. When she had finished, he said only, "I have been waiting 40 years to hear someone say that out loud, Mrs. Ashby. Your father said it once in this office in 1998, and then he never said it again. I am glad to have heard it twice in one lifetime." She stopped at the general store. Hattie Bramble was behind the counter wearing the navy cardigan again, as though she had known what day this was. Eleanor told her too. Hattie listened. Hattie nodded once. Then Hattie reached beneath the counter and brought out a small wooden sign painted a long time ago. The paint cracked but still readable. No one is turned away. Your daddy gave this to Frank in 1986, she said. Frank kept it behind the counter all those years. He said your daddy told him someday a person is going to come into this store who needs this sign. When that person comes in, you'll know. Honey, you came in. Eleanor took the sign in both hands. She did not try to speak. Hattie reached across the counter and laid her wide, warm hand on Eleanor's cheek, the way a mother lays her hand on a daughter's cheek before sending her out the door on a cold morning. And then she said, "Go home and hang it up, sweetheart. It's been waiting a long time." She drove back up the mountain with the wooden sign on the passenger seat, where the folder of property documents had ridden 11 days before. She parked. She climbed the steps. She did not unlock the door yet. First she took a hammer and a single small nail, and she hung the sign above the front door at the exact height where a tall man, perhaps her own father, perhaps a young man of 20 walking out of the snow, would see it from the porch step. No one is turned away. She stepped back to look at it. The cream paint along the trim caught the late sun. The sign sat level and clean. she thought. That is enough for today. That is enough for one day. Then she went inside and she built up the fire, and she put a kettle of water on the stove, and she sat in the leather chair and waited, because something in her, the part of her that had spent 11 days learning how to be helped, knew that on a day like this one, the cabin would not stay empty. The knock came an hour after sunset. It was soft, almost apologetic. Eleanor rose. She crossed the room. She opened the door. On the porch stood a woman, perhaps 25 years old. She wore a thin cloth coat that had been clean once and was not clean now. She held in her arms, wrapped in a faded yellow baby blanket, a child no older than 15 months. The child was asleep. The woman's lower lip was bleeding from a place she had clearly been biting. Her car, Eleanor could see beyond her in the clearing, was a hatchback with one front tire flat and the driver's side window covered by a black trash bag. The woman opened her mouth. She tried to speak. What came out instead was a small sound that was not quite a word. Eleanor did not ask the woman's name. She did not ask the woman's reason. She remembered as clearly as if it were yesterday morning. A brass bell over the door of a general store, and a wide warm hand laid on her own cheek, and the long calm voice of an old woman saying, "Come sit by the stove." Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. She said gently the words she had been being taught all her life to say, and had only just now learned she was allowed to say herself. "Come in, there's a fire on. Come sit by it." The young woman came in. She sat in the leather chair with the baby in her lap. Eleanor took the yellow blanket gently and laid it over them both. She went to the kitchen and warmed a small pan of milk for the child and a mug of broth for the mother. She brought them on a wooden tray. She set the tray on the small table beside the chair. She added a fresh log to the fire, not the seasoned oak Walter Pike had given her. That one was for tomorrow night. She would save it. But a length of hickory from the south wall of cordwood the 16-year-old boy had cut without ever knocking on the door. The new log caught quickly. The flames rose up clean and tall. The young woman closed her eyes. The baby, still sleeping, made a small contented sound. Eleanor sat down across from them on the pine chair from the kitchen table. She did not speak. She watched her hands fold in her lap, the way they had folded in her lap since she was a small girl, learning that arguing with the Walkers never changed anything. They did not fold the same way tonight. They folded the way a woman's hands fold when she has finally found, after 61 years, the room she is supposed to be standing in. After a long time, the young woman opened her eyes. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at the fire. She said very quietly, "I didn't know where else to come." And Eleanor, who at 6 years old had stood in a kitchen in Charleston, watching her mother stand at a window waiting for a man who at 31 years old had thrown a Christmas card from her father in the trash unopened, who at 59 had buried Henry on a wet October Tuesday, and learned the particular silence of a house with one set of footsteps in it, who at 61 had driven up a mountain in a snowstorm to claim an inheritance her brothers had laughed at, and had instead been given the only inheritance that had ever mattered. Eleanor smiled the small private smile she had not smiled in 18 months. She said, "I know, honey, I know exactly. You're in the right place." The fire crackled. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, slow and patient and unhurried. Somewhere far down the mountain, a single set of taillights moved away into the dark, and a brick house in West Asheville sat with its lights on at an hour when its 81-year-old occupant was likely sitting up alone, waiting for a telephone that Eleanor had decided sometime between the Strongbox and the sign over the door she was not going to be the one to call. There were stories that needed telling. There were also stories that, once you understood them, did not need to be told to be true. Margaret Sloane Walker had spent 40 years building a silence. Eleanor was going to spend the rest of her own life building a fire. The fire would be the answer. The fire would be the only answer she needed to give. She stayed up that night long after the young mother and the baby had fallen asleep in the leather chair. She moved them gently to the bedroom, the woman barely waking the child, not at all. And she covered them with the heavy quilt her great-grandmother Ruth had pieced in 1928, which Eleanor had found folded in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed 3 nights before. She came back into the main room. She added another log. She stood at the window and looked out at the snow falling slow and clean across the frozen pond and the line of black hoofprints the deer had left at dawn already half filled in. She touched the brass key hanging once again against the hollow of her throat. Keep the fire burning. She had thought in the beginning that those 4 words had been her father's instruction to her. She understood now that they had been older than her father. They had been Ruth's words first. They would be someone else's words after her. Someone whose name Eleanor did not yet know, whose face she had not yet seen, who would come up this mountain someday. In some season, Eleanor would not live to see and would find the cabin lit and would step through a door above which a small wooden sign would still be hanging. The paint a little more cracked, the words still readable. No one is turned away. And that person Eleanor thought would understand the way she had finally understood. The cabin had never been a piece of property. It had been a promise. The promise had been passed down one quiet woman at a time for 136 winters. The promise was hers now. She would keep it, and then she would pass it on. The fire burned bright and steady on the hearth. The cream paint along the trim was almost dry. The kettle on the stove began very softly to sing. Outside, the snow fell on the cabin, on the pond, on the deer tracks, on the small wooden sign above the door. The cabin glowed warm against the dark mountain, a single lit window in a forest of trees. And somewhere inside, a woman who had been forgotten her entire life. A woman who had finally learned that she had not been forgotten at all, only kept sat in a leather chair watching the fire, listening for the sound of the next knock at the door. If this story found you tonight, friend, if any part of Eleanor's long quiet walk up that mountain landed somewhere in your own chest, I want to ask you one thing before you go to sleep. Somewhere in your life, somewhere in your 60 or 70 or 80 years on this earth, there was a door that opened for you when you had nowhere else to go. There was a fire someone built for you when you were too cold to build your own. Will you tell me in the comments below about the person who let you in? Tell me their name if you remember it. Tell me what they fed you, what they said, whether they ever asked you why you had come. Because tonight, in a small cabin in a forest somewhere, a fire is burning that they helped to light, and they should know. Sleep well, friend. The door is open, the fire is on, and we'll be here again tomorrow night telling another story for everyone who needs to come in from the cold.